I'm going to say something to you you're probably not going to like. Comparing yourself to other people isn't your problem. The real problem is what you believe about yourself that makes the comparison feel true. So stay with me on that, because I know it sounds a little confronting. By the end of this, I think you're going to understand what I mean. And more importantly, you're going to have something genuinely useful for the next time you find yourself comparing yourself to others and feeling like you come off short. Here's what we're going to cover. I want to explain to you why your brain compares and why telling yourself to stop is actually a little bit like telling yourself to stop breathing. I want to go deeper into the usual, you're comparing your behind the scenes to everyone's highlight reel, because I think you already know that, and it's not helping. And then I want to give you a real tool, something you can actually use in the moment, not a platitude, a practice. So let's go. Here's something most people don't know. Comparison is not a bad habit you developed. It's a function of the human brain. It's literally built in. So back in our evolutionary history, being aware of where you stood relative to other people in your group, it was a survival skill. So if someone was getting more resources, more status, more protection, you needed to know. That information could determine whether you ate, whether you were safe, whether you belonged. The brain that didn't track social standing was actually at a disadvantage. So your brain became, over hundreds of thousands of years, a comparing machine. So psychologists call this social comparison theory. And it was first described in the 1950s by a social psychologist named Leon Festinger. He found that we have this drive, not a choice, a drive to evaluate ourselves by comparing ourselves to others. And we do it in two directions. So the first direction is what is called upward comparison. So we look at someone who appears to be doing better than us. More success, more followers, more money, a better body, a more glamorous life. And then there's the downward comparison, looking at someone who seems to be struggling more than us. So we do both. And honestly, the downward comparison is its own uncomfortable rabbit hole that we don't talk about enough, because it can feel temporarily good, like relief. And that's not exactly our finest hour either. But the upward comparison, that's the one that really stings. And it's the one most of us mean when we talk about comparison and anxiety. So if you catch yourself looking at someone's life and feeling that familiar twist in your chest, that why is her life so together and mine isn't feeling, that is not a character flaw. That's your ancient brain doing exactly what it was designed to do. So the problem is, this evolved in a world where you were comparing yourself to maybe 150 people in your immediate tribe, not 150 million strangers on the internet. And this is why just stop comparing yourself to others is just absolutely useless advice. You can't just stop. It's neurologically automatic. So it happens before your conscious mind even gets involved. It's a reflex. Telling yourself to stop comparing is like telling yourself to stop blinking. You can do it for a little while if you really concentrate. But the moment you get distracted, there it is again. What we can do is change our relationship to the comparison. So we can change what happens after the reflex fires. But the reflex itself, that's not going away, and spending energy fighting it is just adding another layer of self-criticism to an already uncomfortable experience. Why am I doing this again? I know I shouldn't compare myself. What's wrong with me? And now you're comparing yourself to some imaginary version of yourself who doesn't compare yourself. So it's comparison all the way down. So let's stop trying to eliminate it and start understanding it. Because when you understand what's actually driving it, you get real power over it. Now, social media. Yes, you've probably heard the highlight reel thing. You're seeing everyone's best moments, the holiday photos, the promotions, the glowing skin, the thriving business launch, and you're comparing that to your ordinary Tuesday. And that's real. That asymmetry does matter. But I want to go a layer deeper because I think there's something more insidious happening that we don't talk about. Social media doesn't just show you a curated version of other people's lives. It actively selects for the content most likely to trigger comparison because that content keeps you on the platform longer. So envy, inadequacy, curiosity about how someone else is doing, these emotions are engaging. They hold your attention. And of course, the algorithm has figured this out. So you're not just seeing a highlight reel by accident. You're being deliberately shown the content that's most likely to make you feel like you're falling behind. And then you're handed more of it the moment that you engage. There's also something specific happening with parasocial comparison. That's comparing yourself to people you follow online, but you don't actually know. So with a friend, at least you've got context. You know about her difficult marriage, her health scare, the years she spent rebuilding her life. With someone that you follow online, you have none of that. You're comparing your full inner life, your doubts, your fears, your exhaustion, to a stranger's external presentation. It's not a fair fight. It was never going to be a fair fight. And here's the thing that I find most troubling about it. The more time we spend in that comparison loop online, the more we start to absorb values that aren't even ours. So we start wanting things, the aesthetic, the lifestyle, the kind of success. Not because we genuinely want them, but because the repetition has made them feel normal, made them feel expected, made them feel required. I'll come back to this in a minute because it's the key to the tool I want to give you. But first, the heart of it. So here's the thing I really want you to sit with. Comparison only hurts when you already believe you're not enough. So think about it. When you're genuinely secure in something, truly at peace with it, you can look at someone else excelling at the exact thing and feel nothing but goodwill. You can celebrate them. You can be curious about them. You could admire them with that undertow of, and without the undertow of, and therefore I'm less. So the comparison only stings because it lands on something that's already sore. The comparison is not the wound. It's the pressure on a bruise that was already there. That's what I talk about with you, and so many of the things that I talk about, it's in the one that I call the story you tell yourself is slowly destroying you, right? Watch that or listen to that, because the story running underneath comparison is almost always some version of it. I'm not enough. I've not done enough. I should be further along. And when something from the outside world appears to confirm that story, it doesn't feel like an opinion. It feels like evidence. That's why, intellectually, that you can have no business comparing yourself to someone with a completely different life, a different starting point, a different set of circumstances, and still not be able to stop the feeling, because the feeling's not coming from logic. It's coming from a belief that's been sitting in your nervous system for a very long time. And I want to say something here for those of you who are in midlife, because this is where I see comparison get particularly brutal. In your 20s, comparison has a kind of energy to it. There's still time. The gap between where you are and where someone else is feels closable. But in midlife, something shifts. The comparison starts to feel more like an accounting, like you're being measured against where you were supposed to be by now. The career you were going to have, the relationship you were going to build, the person you were going to become. And there's this invisible ledger. It's partly culture, it's partly family, it's partly things you absorbed from the world around you. And you're checking your progress against it and you're coming up short. What I want to say to you is this. That ledger is not yours. That timeline was never yours. And the sooner you see that, the freer you get. One of the things I find genuinely fascinating is what happens when people take my happiness quiz. It's free, and link is in the description. They often come out surprised because they went in thinking that their happiness was affected by one thing, and the quiz reveals something different's going on underneath. And comparison, how much energy they're spending measuring their life against someone else's, is almost always a bigger factor than they expected. It always shows up in ways that they hadn't named. So if you want to understand your own patterns better, that's a good place to start. The link's in the description. I want to tell you about something that happened to me a few years into doing this work. I was at an event. It was a wellness and personal development kind of gathering. And I found myself sitting in the audience watching another speaker, and she was brilliant. The room was hang on every word. The energy was electric, and something in me kind of sank a little bit. Not because she wasn't good, because she was. Because something in my brain immediately started running the comparison. Her audience versus mine. Her way of presenting versus mine. The recognition she was getting versus what I felt I had. And I sat there for a few minutes, not really listening, just running this little bit of a calculation about whether I was enough. And after a few minutes of doing this, I had this moment of clarity. And the clarity was this: I was running a race I'd never signed up for. Because what I actually wanted, when I was honest with myself, was to reach the people I could reach in a way that I could reach them, and to do work that felt meaningful, that felt good. And that's it. That was my finish line. And her success had absolutely nothing to do with that. Her audience growing didn't shrink mine. Her brilliance didn't diminish me. The race was only happening in my head. And it was a race. In those few minutes, I realized I was losing because I had entered it without even realizing that I'd entered it. You know, years before that, when I was traveling, I spent about 13 years in one stretch with one bag, traveling all over the world. And some of that time I was in places where the whole architecture of comparison just didn't exist in the same way. I spent time in a little country called Bhutan, which is extraordinary. It's the country that famously measures gross national happiness rather than GDP. And one of the things that struck me while I was there for a while was the near absence of that constant social comparison that I was so used to. People weren't measuring themselves against what their neighbor had. There was a different organizing principle at work. And I remember sitting with a woman who was cooking for a group of us, just completely absorbed in what she was doing, so present, so unbothered by what anyone else was doing or having or achieving. And I thought, what does she know that the rest of us have forgotten? What she knew, or maybe more accurately, what the culture had preserved, was that the only meaningful measure of a life is whether it's being lived according to what you actually value. Not what someone else values, not what the culture has decided to prize this decade, what you actually genuinely care about. And that's the tool I want to leave you with. When you catch yourself in a comparison spiral, when you feel that familiar ache looking at someone else's life, I want you to pause and ask yourself one question. Is this something I actually want? Or is this something I think I should want? That's it. That's the whole question. Because most comparison pain is not really about the thing you're comparing. It's about chasing a goal that was never yours to begin with. It's someone else's version of success, someone else's version of a good body, someone else's version of a beautiful home or a thriving career or an exciting life. You absorbed it somewhere along the way, from family, from culture, from the algorithm, and now it's running in the background like an app you never opened, but it's draining your battery. So do a quick audit. When the comparison hits, name what you're comparing and then ask, do I actually want that? If I had that, would it make me feel like my life was meaningful, or would I be holding it up to the next person who had something slightly shinier? If the honest answer is, I don't actually want that, and often it is, then the comparison loses most of its power. You're not losing a race. You're watching a race that has nothing to do with you. And if the answer is, actually, yes, I do want that, that's useful too, because now you can have an honest conversation with yourself about whether you're moving toward it and why. And that conversation is much more productive than a spiral. Your life is not a ranking. It's not a ledger. It's not a race. It's not a performance review against someone else's highlights. It's a practice, a daily, imperfect, deeply personal practice of figuring out what you actually value and trying to live in that direction. And the only question that matters, the only one, is whether you're living according to what you actually value, not what someone else's Instagram told you to value, not the invisible timeline you absorbed somewhere in your 20s, what you actually genuinely care about. When you're grounded in that, comparison doesn't disappear. Remember, the brain is a comparing machine. It will keep comparing, but it stops having teeth because you're no longer running a race you never signed up for. I hope this was helpful. If it landed for you, please subscribe. This is exactly the type of thing we get into every week. And if you haven't taken the happiness quiz yet, the link is there. It takes a few minutes. It might show you about something about yourself that's worth knowing. As always, be kind, take care, go gently in the world.